The moment my future daughter-in-law called me a pig at my own son's wedding, the entire room went silent. We were standing in the grand ballroom of Hunter Estates, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, white roses, and nearly 300 guests. I had spent months swallowing insults for Ethan's sake, telling myself that love required patience. Then Vanessa looked me up and down, wrinkled her nose, and snapped. Could someone move this pig away from the family photos? A few people gasped. My son froze. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. But what Vanessa didn't know was that every wall around her, every flower arrangement, every table, every sparkling light in that luxurious venue belonged to me. And before the day was over, the truth would change everything. If this story touches you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy heartfelt family stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone humiliated you in front of an entire wedding? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always enjoy reading your messages. My name is Joyce Hunter, and if you had met me before all this happened, you probably never would have guessed that I owned one of the most successful event venue businesses in our part of Ohio. That was exactly how I liked it. I never cared much about designer handbags, luxury cars, or showing off wealth. Maybe that came from the life I had lived before success ever found me. Or maybe it came from losing the love of my life far too early. I was 34 years old when my husband, Michael Hunter, died. Even now, nearly 30 years later, I can still remember the phone call. I remember standing in our tiny kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. I remember Ethan, only 6 years old at the time, coloring superheroes at the table. And I remember the police officer's voice. Calm, professional, life-changing. There had been an accident on Interstate 71. A drunk driver crossed into Michael's lane. My husband never made it home. One moment, I was a wife. The next, I was a widow with a little boy who couldn't understand why his father wasn't coming back. Those first years were the hardest years of my life. Money was tight. Really tight. Michael had been the primary breadwinner. I worked part-time at a local bakery, but that income barely covered groceries. I sold jewelry. I sold furniture. I sold almost everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. More than once, I sat at the kitchen table late at night, staring at unpaid bills while Ethan slept upstairs. There were moments when fear felt like a permanent resident in my home. But every morning, I got up and kept going, because I didn't have another choice. Because Ethan needed me. I worked wherever I could. I cleaned offices before sunrise. I worked at the bakery during the day. I answered phones for a small insurance agency in the evenings. Sometimes I slept only 4 hours a night. I was exhausted all the time. Yet somehow, those years also became some of my most meaningful memories, because Ethan and I became a team, a real team. Every Friday night, we'd order the cheapest pizza in town and watch movies together. Every birthday, even when money was scarce. I found a way to make him feel special. Every school event, every baseball game, every parent-teacher conference, I was there. I promised myself that my son would never feel abandoned. One evening, when Ethan was about 12, he looked at me while we were washing dishes. "Mom, yeah, when I grow up, I'm going to take care of you." I laughed. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do." "Why?" He shrugged. "Because you've always taken care of me." I nearly cried right there at the sink. Moments like that kept me going. They reminded me why all the sacrifice mattered. As Ethan got older, things slowly improved. I started working as an assistant coordinator for wedding events. The pay wasn't amazing, but I discovered something unexpected. I loved the work. I loved helping people celebrate important moments. I loved organizing details. I loved turning empty rooms into beautiful memories. For the first time in years, I felt excited about my future. Then an opportunity appeared. Most people thought I was crazy. An old property outside town had gone bankrupt. It had once been a small event venue, but had fallen into terrible condition. The roof leaked. The gardens were dead. The ballroom looked abandoned. Everyone saw a disaster. I saw a possibility, using every dollar I had saved, along with a frightening bank loan. I bought the property. I still remember signing those papers with shaking hands. The bank manager actually asked me if I was sure. I wasn't. Not completely, but I believed in myself, and that was enough. The first 2 years were brutal. I painted walls myself. I planted flowers myself. I cleaned bathrooms myself. There were days when I worked 18 hours straight. Ethan helped whenever he could. As a teenager, he spent countless weekends carrying supplies, mowing lawns, and helping me prepare for events. We built that place together, brick by brick, dream by dream. Slowly, things began to change. Customers returned. Word spread. More weddings were booked. More events followed. Then, another property became available. Then, another. Years passed. Hunter Estates grew from one struggling venue into several highly sought-after event locations throughout the region. The business became successful beyond anything I had imagined. Financially, I never had to worry again. But I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot the years of counting pennies. I never forgot the sleepless nights. And I never forgot the promise I made to myself after Michael died. Stay humble. Stay grateful. Stay grounded. That was why I still lived in the same modest home I had owned for decades. That was why I still drove a practical SUV instead of a luxury car. That was why most people had no idea how much money I actually had, including my own son. People often find that surprising. Why wouldn't I tell Ethan everything? The answer is simple. I didn't want him growing up believing wealth would solve every problem. I wanted him to build something of his own. I wanted him to understand responsibility, so I helped him when he needed it. But I never handed him an easy life. And honestly, it worked. Ethan became a successful engineer. He worked hard. He earned respect. He built his own career. I couldn't have been prouder. By the time he reached his mid-30s, he was everything a mother could hope for. Kind, responsible, thoughtful, or at least, that's what I believed. Because looking back now, I can see exactly when things started changing. At first, it was subtle. A missed phone call, a canceled dinner, a birthday gathering cut short because he had other plans. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately raised alarms. But mothers notice things, especially mothers who have spent decades paying attention to every detail of their child's life. The change began shortly after Ethan met Vanessa Caldwell. At the time, I wanted nothing more than for him to be happy. I remember the excitement in his voice the first time he mentioned her. I remember the smile on his face. I remember thinking that maybe this was the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. What I didn't know was that Vanessa's arrival would become the beginning of the most painful chapter of my life. And before long, I would learn that not everyone who smiles at your family truly wishes your family well. The first time I met Vanessa Caldwell, I genuinely wanted to like her. Maybe that's because she made Ethan look happy. Or maybe it's because I had spent so many years hoping he would find someone who loved him as deeply as I did. When you've raised a child alone, you eventually reach a point where you understand they need a life beyond you, a family beyond you, a future beyond you. I thought Vanessa might be part of that future. The day Ethan brought her to my house for dinner, I spent the entire afternoon preparing. I cooked roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie from my late mother's recipe. Nothing fancy, just comfort food. The kind of meal that says, "Welcome to the family." I remember checking the oven clock every few minutes. I was nervous, excited, hopeful. When Ethan finally pulled into the driveway, I rushed to the front window like a teenager waiting for her first date. The woman who stepped out of the passenger seat was undeniably beautiful. Long blonde hair, perfect makeup, elegant designer clothes. Everything about her looked polished, expensive, carefully curated. As they walked to the front door, Ethan wrapped his arm around her waist. His smile reached all the way to his eyes. That alone made me smile. The doorbell rang. I opened the door. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, hugging Ethan. Then I turned toward Vanessa. "And you must be Vanessa." She smiled warmly. "You must be Joyce. Ethan talks about you all the time." Her voice was pleasant, friendly, almost charming. I remember feeling relieved. Maybe I had worried for nothing. Maybe this was going to be easy. Dinner started wonderfully. Vanessa complimented the food. She laughed at Ethan's stories. She asked polite questions. Everything seemed normal. But looking back now, I realized the warning signs appeared much earlier than I understood. The first clue came during dessert. Vanessa glanced around my dining room. It wasn't a large room. The furniture was old, but well cared for. Family photos covered the walls. Pictures of Ethan growing up. Pictures of Michael. Pictures of birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments. The things that mattered to me. Vanessa smiled. "So, you've lived here a long time." "Almost 30 years," I said. "Really? Since Ethan was little." She looked around again. "Have you ever thought about upgrading?" The question caught me off guard. Upgrading? You know, a bigger house? I laughed. I never really needed one. "Oh." Something flashed briefly across her face. Not disappointment exactly, more like confusion, as if my answer didn't fit into her understanding of the world. The conversation moved on, at least temporarily. A few minutes later, she asked another question. "So, what do you do these days?" "I run some event properties." Event properties. A few wedding and event venues. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh. Then she immediately changed the subject. At the time, I didn't think much about it, but now I realize she wasn't interested because I hadn't given her the answer she wanted. She expected details, titles, status, numbers. Instead, I had spoken simply, so she assumed the business wasn't important. Throughout the evening, little moments continued to accumulate, like pebbles filling a jar. Nah. Harmless individually, concerning together. When Ethan excused himself to answer a phone call, Vanessa leaned closer. Can I ask you something? Of course. How much student debt did Ethan graduate with? I blinked. The question felt strangely personal. He paid most of it off years ago. Oh. She stirred her coffee. That's good. Then another question. Did his father leave anything behind? My husband? Yes. A small insurance policy. Nothing major. I stared at her. The question felt inappropriate, but I forced a smile. Nothing life-changing. Again, she seemed oddly disappointed. That feeling lingered long after she left that night. I couldn't quite explain it. There was nothing openly rude about her behavior. Nothing obvious. Nothing I could point to and say. That's the problem. Still, something felt off. A few weeks later, Ethan invited me to lunch. Naturally, Vanessa came too. That lunch became the first time I truly saw another side of her. We were sitting at a restaurant when our waitress approached. The woman looked exhausted, probably in her 20s, trying her best during a busy lunch rush when she accidentally brought the wrong drink. Vanessa's entire demeanor changed. Her smile disappeared instantly. Her tone became cold, sharp, dismissive. She spoke to the waitress as if the young woman were beneath her. The waitress apologized repeatedly. Vanessa rolled her eyes. It's not that difficult. The girl looked embarrassed. I felt uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. After the waitress walked away, I quietly said, Everyone makes mistakes. Vanessa laughed. If you can't do your job properly, maybe you shouldn't have that job. I noticed Ethan glanced down at his menu. He didn't agree, but he didn't challenge her either. That bothered me a lot, because the Ethan I raised was kind, patient, compassionate. Yet something was already changing. Not dramatically, just little compromises, little silences, little moments where he chose peace over truth. Months passed. The relationship became serious. Then came the first major family gathering. My niece Melissa hosted a barbecue at her house. Dozens of relatives attended. Everyone was excited to meet Vanessa. At first, she charmed everyone. She knew how to do that. She could be incredibly likable when she wanted to be. But eventually, her mask slipped. Melissa and I were standing near the patio discussing a charity fundraiser when Vanessa approached. She listened for a moment, then asked casually, So, Joyce, how much did that fundraiser raise last year? About $80,000. That's impressive. It helped a lot of local families. Vanessa smiled. And how much did you personally donate? I laughed. A little. A little? Melissa frowned. What kind of question is that? Vanessa quickly smiled. Oh, I was just curious. But I noticed something. Every question she asked eventually led back to money, assets, property, income, investments. Status. It wasn't curiosity. It was evaluation, like she was trying to determine someone's value. A few weeks later, I overheard something that stayed with me. Vanessa didn't know I was nearby. She was talking with one of her friends at a bridal boutique. I had arrived early for an appointment. The two women hadn't seen me. Her friend asked, "What do you think of Ethan's mom?" Vanessa laughed softly. "She's nice enough." Then came the sentence that changed everything. Honestly, I expected more. More? You know, Ethan's successful. I thought his family would be different. Different. I stood frozen behind a display rack. Her friend laughed. "What do you mean?" Vanessa lowered her voice. "She dresses like she shops at discount stores." The women giggled. "And have you seen her house?" More laughter. I quietly turned around and left before they could see me. That drive home was one of the loneliest drives I can remember. Not because a stranger had judged me, but because that stranger was becoming part of my family. And for the first time, a terrible thought entered my mind. What if Vanessa didn't love Ethan for who he was? What if she loved the image of success she believed came with him? At the time, I pushed the thought away. I told myself I was being unfair, judgmental, protective. Maybe overly protective. But deep down, something had already begun to worry me. Because every time Vanessa looked at me, I had the growing feeling that she wasn't seeing a person. She was seeing a balance sheet, and she didn't like the numbers she thought she saw. What she didn't realize was that she had misread the entire account. A few months after Ethan proposed to Vanessa, I received a phone call that should have made me happy. Instead, it became the beginning of a secret that would eventually change everything. "Mom!" Ethan said excitedly. I could hear the grin in his voice. "We found the venue." I smiled. "That's wonderful. Vanessa absolutely loves it." "Which one?" There was a brief pause. Then he said the name. Hunter Estates Grand Hall. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Of all the venues in the state, of all the luxury locations available, they had chosen mine. Not just one of mine, the flagship property, the crown jewel of the entire Hunter Estates brand. I stared out my kitchen window in silence. "Mom, I'm here. Have you heard of it?" I almost laughed. Had I heard of it, I had spent 20 years building it. Every garden, every ballroom, every stone pathway, every chandelier, every private suite. My fingerprints were on everything. But instead of telling him that, I simply said, "Yes, it's very beautiful." Vanessa suddenly came onto the call. "Oh my God, Joyce, it's amazing." Her enthusiasm sounded genuine. "I've dreamed about getting married there for years." "Really?" "Absolutely. It's where all the important weddings happen." Something about that sentence bothered me. The important weddings. Not beautiful weddings. Not meaningful weddings. Important weddings. As if value came from status. As if love required an audience. Still, I kept those thoughts to myself. "When's the tour?" I asked. "Saturday," Ethan said. "You should come." I hesitated. then agreed. Of course. What neither of them knew was that I wasn't planning to attend as the owner. I intended to attend as Ethan's mother. Nothing more, nothing less. Saturday arrived. The moment I pulled into the property, memories flooded back. The gardens were blooming beautifully. The fountains sparkled under the morning sun. White hydrangeas lined the walkways. The building looked exactly the way I had envisioned years earlier while sketching ideas on napkins. I felt proud. Not because it was expensive, but because it represented decades of sacrifice. Inside the lobby, I immediately spotted Daniel Brooks, my general manager, my right hand for nearly 20 years. Daniel froze when he saw me. Mrs. Hunter. I quickly shook my head. His eyes widened. Then he understood. Instantly. Joyce. He corrected himself. I smiled. Good morning. After all these years. Daniel knew how to read me. He knew I was hiding something, but he also knew not to ask questions in front of others. A few minutes later, Ethan and Vanessa arrived. Vanessa looked like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. Designer handbag, designer sunglasses, designer shoes, everything perfectly coordinated. The venue coordinator began the tour. As she described various features, I noticed something interesting. Vanessa barely listened when they discussed practical details. Parking, capacity, logistics. Instead, her attention sharpened whenever luxury was mentioned. VIP packages, celebrity weddings, exclusive memberships, prestige, status, recognition. At one point, the coordinator mentioned that several well-known public figures had hosted events there. Vanessa practically glowed. This is exactly what I wanted. The coordinator smiled. We're honored. Then she added something that made me quietly uncomfortable. Many families wait years for an opening here. Vanessa immediately turned toward Ethan. See, this proves it's worth it. Worth it. Again. It sounded less like she was planning a marriage and more like she was purchasing an achievement. The tour continued. When we entered the grand ballroom, Vanessa gasped. To be fair, most people did. The room was stunning. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens. Elegant architecture created a timeless atmosphere. I remembered the day construction finished. I remembered standing alone in that empty room and crying because I had finally accomplished something I once thought impossible. Now I stood there as a guest, watching someone else admire it. It felt strangely surreal. Then something unexpected happened. The coordinator turned toward me. Recognition flashed briefly across her face. My heart skipped. She had only worked there a few years, but she knew exactly who I was. Mrs. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Her eyes widened. She recovered immediately. Ma'am, what do you think of the ballroom? Smooth. Very smooth. I smiled. It's beautiful. Vanessa laughed. Beautiful, that's all. I looked around. Yes. She exchanged an amused glance with her mother. Patricia. I noticed it. I noticed everything. Patricia had joined the tour halfway through. And unlike Ethan, she didn't bother hiding her judgments. Patricia looked at me the same way some people look at furniture. Present, but insignificant. The coordinator continued describing pricing options. Then came a number. A very large number. Vanessa didn't flinch. Patricia nodded approvingly. Richard Caldwell, Vanessa's father, simply said, "Quality costs money." The comment itself wasn't offensive. What came next was, Patricia glanced at me. "I suppose this kind of place probably seems extravagant to some people." Her eyes lingered on my modest clothing. I understood exactly what she meant. I smiled politely. "Maybe." Patricia laughed softly. "Well, fortunately, Ethan and Vanessa understand the value of investing in appearances." Appearances? Interesting choice of words. I looked around the ballroom, around the venue, around the property I had built. Then I looked back at Patricia. She genuinely believed she was speaking to someone beneath her, someone ordinary, someone insignificant. The irony was almost funny. Almost. Later that afternoon, while Ethan and Vanessa reviewed contracts, Daniel quietly approached me in a private hallway. "What are you doing?" he asked. I smiled. "Being a mother." "You could tell them." "I could? Why don't you?" I looked through a nearby window toward the gardens. For several seconds, I didn't answer. Finally, I said, "Because I need to know who they are before they know who I am." Daniel studied me carefully. "You think something's wrong?" "I think something feels wrong." He nodded slowly. Then he surprised me. "I agree." I turned toward him. "You do?" Daniel lowered his voice. "I've watched hundreds of couples come through these doors. And some people fall in love with each other." He paused. "Some people fall in love with what they think they're getting." His words stayed with me long after he walked away. That evening, Ethan called again. He sounded happier than I'd heard him in years. "Mom, we booked it." "I know. I can't believe we're getting married there." I smiled sadly. Neither could I. Not for the reasons he imagined. As the weeks passed, wedding planning intensified. Vanessa became obsessed with every detail. The flowers had to be perfect. The invitations had to be perfect. The photographs had to be perfect. The guest list had to impress exactly the right people. The more planning I observed, the more one thing became clear. This wedding wasn't becoming a celebration of love. It was becoming a performance. And Vanessa desperately wanted an audience. Still, I kept my secret. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa knew the truth. Neither knew that I owned Hunter Estates. Neither knew that every contract they signed eventually landed on my desk. Neither knew that the venue they admired so much existed because a widowed mother once refused to give up. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain yet, I had a growing feeling that keeping that secret would soon become very important. Very important indeed. The closer we got to the wedding, the more difficult it became to ignore what was happening. At first, Vanessa's comments had been subtle, small enough that I could convince myself I was imagining things. But once the wedding planning entered full swing, subtlety disappeared. What replaced it was something much harder to overlook. Disrespect. The first major incident happened during a bridal planning luncheon. Vanessa had invited several women from both families to discuss decorations, dresses, flowers, and other wedding details. I arrived carrying a small notebook filled with ideas. Not because I wanted control, not because I wanted attention, simply because I was excited. This was my son's wedding. I wanted to help. When I walked into the private dining room, everyone greeted me warmly except Vanessa. She glanced up briefly. "Hi, Joyce," then immediately returned to her phone. I sat down and smiled. The meeting began. Several women shared ideas, centerpieces, colors, music. Everything seemed normal. Then I suggested a flower arrangement. A simple arrangement. Elegant and timeless. The kind that worked beautifully in formal venues. Before I even finished speaking, Vanessa interrupted. "Oh, that's a little outdated." The room became quiet. I smiled politely. "Maybe," Patricia laughed. "Different generations have different tastes." The way she said it felt less like a statement and more like a dismissal. I stayed quiet. A few minutes later, another guest suggested almost the exact same floral concept. Vanessa clapped her hands. "Oh my God, I love that." Several women exchanged awkward glances. I noticed. So did they. But nobody said anything. Not even Ethan. Especially not Ethan. And that hurt. As the weeks passed, these moments multiplied. One afternoon, Vanessa invited me to join her wedding dress fitting. I honestly thought it was an olive branch. Maybe we were finally getting closer. Maybe I had judged her too harshly. The moment I arrived, I realized how wrong I was. The boutique was filled with expensive gowns. Vanessa stood in front of a mirror wearing a stunning dress. Everyone complimented her. She looked beautiful. I genuinely meant it when I told her so. Then she looked at my outfit, a simple navy blouse and slacks. Comfortable, practical, perfectly appropriate for a shopping appointment. Yet Vanessa frowned. "You know, Joyce." I looked up. "Yes. If we're taking pictures today, maybe next time you could dress up a little more." I blinked. "I'm sorry." She smiled sweetly, the fake smile she often used when disguising criticism. "It's just that appearances matter." I felt heat rise in my face. One of the bridal consultants immediately looked uncomfortable. So did several others. But Vanessa continued. "The wedding photos will last forever." The implication was obvious. I didn't belong in the picture she wanted to create. Not looking the way I did. Not dressing the way I dressed. Not existing the way I existed. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. I considered revealing that the venue she worshipped existed because of the woman she was criticizing. I considered telling her that my business account could buy every dress in the store. Instead, I smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." On the drive home, I cried. Not because of the clothes, not because of the insult, because I couldn't understand why she seemed so determined to make me feel small. Weeks later, another incident occurred. This time at a dinner hosted by Patricia and Richard Caldwell. Their home was impressive, large, expensive, designed to impress visitors. Throughout the evening, Richard talked constantly about investments, stocks, real estate, business deals. Everything eventually circled back to money. Then he turned toward me. "So, Joyce, are you retired?" "No." "What exactly do you do?" I owned some event properties. The same answer I always gave. Simple. Truthful. Richard nodded absent-mindedly. Small venues, Vanessa answered before I could. I think so. The table laughed lightly. Something inside me tightened. Richard took a sip of wine. Well, nothing wrong with small businesses? Patricia smiled. Everyone contributes in their own way. I knew exactly what they believed. They thought I was a modest middle-class widow. Nothing more. Nothing less. And because they believed that, they treated me accordingly. The strange thing was that the money itself didn't bother me. I didn't care whether people knew I was wealthy. What hurt was the assumption that kindness, intelligence, or worth somehow depended on income. The Caldwells treated people differently based on what they thought those people possessed. And unfortunately, they believed I possessed very little. Around this time, Melissa began noticing things too. One evening, she came over for coffee. My niece had always been sharp, observant, difficult to fool. After listening to me describe several recent interactions, she set down her mug. Aunt Joyce, what? Why are you letting this happen? I sighed. Because Ethan loves her. Melissa shook her head. No. What do you mean? You're protecting Ethan. Of course I am. At your own expense. I looked away. She wasn't entirely wrong. The truth was that every insult felt like a test, and every time I stayed silent, I convinced myself I was preserving Ethan's happiness. Maybe if I tolerated enough, maybe if I remained patient enough, eventually Vanessa would soften. Eventually things would improve. At least that's what I hoped. Melissa wasn't convinced. She doesn't respect you. I remained quiet. Honestly, Melissa continued, I don't think she respects anyone she can't benefit from. That sentence lingered in my mind long after she left, because deep down, I feared she might be right. Then came the wedding planning group chat. I wasn't supposed to know about it. One of Ethan's cousins accidentally mentioned it during a family gathering. Oh, wasn't that discussed in the wedding group? What wedding group? The cousin froze, immediately realizing the mistake. Later that evening, I learned the truth. Nearly every family member had been included, except me, even distant relatives, even friends, but not Ethan's mother. When I gently asked Ethan about it, he looked uncomfortable. I think Vanessa just wanted to keep it small. I stared at him. There are 42 people in it. He looked away. I'll talk to her. But he never did. Or if he did, nothing changed. The exclusion hurt more than I expected, because it wasn't about a group chat. It was about being pushed further and further to the edge of my own son's life. One day, I visited Hunter Estates for a routine meeting. Daniel noticed my mood immediately. Tough day, I laughed sadly. Something like that. We walked through one of the gardens. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said something unexpected. People who build their identities around status usually reveal themselves eventually. I looked at him. What makes you say that? I've watched Vanessa. That got my attention. You have? He nodded. She treats executives differently than she treats staff. I already knew exactly what he meant, because I had seen it too. kindness for people above her, contempt for people below her. Daniel stopped walking. You know where that road ends, don't you? Unfortunately, I did. Because every week that passed made the answer clearer. Vanessa wasn't simply overlooking me. She wasn't accidentally being insensitive. She was making a choice, over and over again. A deliberate choice to diminish me, and somehow, despite everything she had already done, I had a feeling the worst was still ahead. Because people who measure human worth by appearances eventually reveal what they truly value. And when that moment came, I feared Ethan would be standing directly in the path of the truth. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact period when I began feeling like a guest in my own son's life. It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a dramatic argument. There wasn't a single event that changed everything. Instead, it happened slowly, quietly. One missed phone call at a time. One canceled dinner at a time. One broken tradition at a time. And somehow, that made it hurt even more. For most of Ethan's life, we spoke nearly every day. Not because I demanded it, not because he felt obligated. We simply enjoyed talking to each other. Sometimes the conversations lasted 30 minutes. Sometimes only 5. But there was always connection. Then Vanessa entered his life. At first, nothing seemed unusual. New relationships naturally require time and attention. I understood that. I wanted him to prioritize his future. I encouraged it. But gradually, small changes began appearing. One Sunday afternoon, I called Ethan. No answer. That wasn't unusual. An hour later, I called again. Still nothing. Later that evening, I received a text. Sorry, Mom. Busy day. Love you. That was it. A 6-word message. For some reason, it left an ache in my chest. Not because he didn't call, because it felt unlike him. Weeks later, I invited Ethan over for dinner, one of our traditions. Just the two of us. He immediately accepted, then canceled the morning of the dinner. Vanessa had made other plans. The following month, the same thing happened. Then again, then again. Eventually, I stopped making plans weeks in advance because I never knew whether they would survive Vanessa's schedule. The worst part wasn't losing time with my son. The worst part was watching him slowly convince himself this was normal. One evening, we finally managed to have dinner together. Vanessa joined us. Halfway through the meal, Ethan's phone rang. He ignored it. 2 minutes later, another call came. Then another. Then another. Vanessa sighed dramatically. Aren't you going to answer? It's work. So, answer. I'm having dinner with Mom. Vanessa rolled her eyes. I noticed. So did Ethan. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Finally, I said, It's okay. Take the call. He looked relieved. Not grateful. Relieved. That realization hit me harder than I expected, because relief meant he felt trapped between us, and somehow, I had become part of the problem. A few days later, Melissa came to visit. She arrived carrying coffee and her usual blunt honesty. "How's Ethan?" I forced a smile. "Busy." Melissa laughed. "That's your answer for everything." "Because it's true?" "No." She shook her head. "You're protecting him again." I sighed. "Melissa." "Aunt Joyce, when was the last time he spent an entire day with you?" I didn't answer. "When was the last time he called first?" Still no answer. Melissa softened. "I'm not trying to hurt you." "I know. You deserve better than this." I stared into my coffee. The problem wasn't that she was wrong. The problem was that she was right. A week later, I attended a wedding industry charity event. Hunter Estates sponsored several local causes every year. Most people there knew me professionally. Not everyone knew I owned the company, but many did. About halfway through the evening, I spotted Ethan and Vanessa across the room. I hadn't realized they were attending. I smiled and walked over. "Ethan." He turned. For a brief moment, his face lit up, the same way it always had. "Mom." He hugged me, and for a second, everything felt normal again. Then Vanessa noticed me. Immediately, her expression changed. Not hostile, just annoyed, as though my presence interrupted something important. "We didn't know you were coming." I smiled. "The organization invited me." "Oh." Her eyes scanned the room. Then she lowered her voice. "These events can be a little overwhelming." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She smiled. Again, that fake smile. "The crowd is very business-oriented." I understood exactly what she was implying. She assumed I didn't belong there. The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I simply nodded. A few minutes later, I excused myself. As I walked away, I heard Vanessa speaking quietly to someone nearby. "That's Ethan's mother." The woman smiled politely. "Oh." Vanessa laughed softly. "She's very simple." Simple. The word followed me all the way home. Simple. As if kindness were simplicity. As if humility were ignorance. As if modesty were weakness. The more Vanessa used words like that, the more I realized something important. She didn't actually know me. Not even a little. She had created an imaginary version of Joyce Hunter in her head. A version she could safely dismiss. A version she could look down upon. And because that version wasn't wealthy or influential or glamorous, she believed it had no value. What she never understood was that true value rarely announces itself. Several weeks later, I learned something that disturbed me even more. It happened accidentally. I was meeting with Daniel at Hunter Estates when he mentioned a conversation he'd overheard between wedding planners. "They're requesting changes again." I laughed. "Vanessa. Who else?" "What kind of changes?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "They want to reduce the family seating section." I frowned. "What family seating section?" "Yours." The room suddenly felt colder. "My section." Daniel nodded. "They moved several of your relatives farther back." "Why?" His expression told me everything. He didn't want to answer. That answer alone was enough. I already knew. Vanessa wanted the front rows filled with people she considered important. business contacts, influential friends, wealthy acquaintances. Status. Always status. Family came second. When Ethan learned about the changes, he promised to fix them. Yet somehow the changes remained. Again and again and again. Every compromise seemed to favor Vanessa. One evening, I finally asked him directly, "Ethan, are you happy?" The question surprised him. "Of course." "Really?" He smiled. "Mom, why would you ask that?" "Because you look tired. Because you seem anxious. Because every conversation feels like you're trying to avoid conflict. Because I barely recognize the man sitting across from me." But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I simply nodded. "I'm glad." Later that night, I cried. Not because I believed Ethan didn't love me. I knew he did. That was never the issue. The issue was something much sadder. He loved everyone so much that he couldn't bring himself to confront anyone, especially Vanessa. Every time she crossed a line, he found a reason to excuse it. Every time she hurt someone, he searched for an explanation. Every time she created conflict, he tried to smooth it over rather than address it. And that weakness was becoming dangerous. A month before the wedding, Melissa came over again. This time, she didn't bother easing into the conversation. "Vanessa wants something." I looked up. "What?" "I don't know yet." "Melissa." "I'm serious." She leaned forward. People like her always reveal themselves eventually. I remembered Daniel saying something similar. Apparently, I wasn't the only one noticing patterns. "What if we're wrong?" I asked. Melissa shook her head. "We're not." Then she said something that sent a chill through me. "I just hope Ethan figures it out before it's too late." At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. I wanted to believe love would fix things. I wanted to believe marriage would mature Vanessa. I wanted to believe my son knew exactly what he was doing. But deep inside, a growing voice kept whispering the same warning. Something wasn't right. Something bigger than rude comments. Bigger than disrespect. Bigger than social status. And whatever it was, I had a feeling it would reveal itself before the wedding day arrived. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, I felt like I had spent months walking through a storm that nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. The wedding was only 24 hours away. Guests had already begun arriving from different states. Hotel rooms were filled. Gift tables were overflowing. Everyone around Ethan and Vanessa seemed excited. Everyone except me. Not because I didn't want my son to be happy. I did, more than anything. But every instinct I possessed as a mother kept warning me that something wasn't right. And those instincts had never failed me before. The rehearsal dinner was held at one of the smaller reception halls within Hunter Estates. It wasn't the main ballroom where the wedding would take place the next day. This venue was more intimate. Warm lighting, elegant decor, private dining space. The kind of room designed to make families feel close. Ironically, I had never felt further from mine. When I arrived, several relatives greeted me warmly. My sister hugged me. Cousins waved. Old family friends smiled. For a few moments, I felt comforted. Then I saw the seating chart, and my stomach dropped. I searched for my name, then searched again. Surely there had been a mistake. There had to be. The mother of the groom should have been seated near Ethan, near immediate family, near the front. Instead, my assigned seat was at the very back of the room. A table filled mostly with distant relatives and acquaintances. People I barely knew. I stared at the card for several seconds. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe they had run out of room. Maybe it was accidental. Then I saw where Patricia and Richard were seated. Front row, center table, directly beside Ethan and Vanessa. The explanation became obvious. A familiar ache settled in my chest. I wasn't forgotten. I had been moved, deliberately. I considered saying something, then decided against it. At least for the moment. The evening continued. Guests mingled. Champagne flowed. Laughter echoed through the room. From a distance, everything looked perfect. But appearances can be deceiving. No one understood that better than I did. Eventually, everyone took their seats. I walked toward the back of the room and sat down. A few relatives noticed immediately. Confused expressions appeared. Whispers followed. My sister approached. "Joyce, are you sure you're at the right table?" I forced a smile. Apparently, her eyebrows rose. Before she could say anything else, the program began. Vanessa stood to welcome everyone. She looked radiant, confident, beautiful, the perfect future bride. If someone had walked into the room at that moment without knowing her, they would have thought she was wonderful. Maybe that's what made everything hurt so much. She knew exactly how to perform kindness. She simply chose not to offer it equally. After thanking guests for attending, Vanessa began introducing key family members. One by one, Patricia received a lengthy tribute. Richard received one too. Several close friends were recognized. Then came my introduction. Vanessa smiled brightly. And of course, Ethan's mother, Joyce. Polite applause followed. Then she added, "She's a very simple woman who taught Ethan the importance of hard work." Simple. Again, that word. Always that word. A few guests smiled awkwardly. Others looked uncomfortable. I noticed every reaction. So did Melissa. She was seated several tables away. The moment Vanessa used that phrase, I saw Melissa's jaw tighten. Vanessa continued speaking. "She's never been interested in luxury or status." A few people chuckled. My face remained expressionless. What Vanessa intended as praise somehow sounded like criticism. As though simplicity were a flaw. As though ambition and worth existed only through visible wealth. When she finally sat down, Melissa immediately marched toward my table. "Did she really just say that?" I shrugged. "What?" "Simple woman." I smiled weakly. "It's fine." "No." Melissa lowered her voice. "It's not." I appreciated her loyalty. I really did. But I was tired. So very tired. Tired of defending myself. Tired of pretending everything was okay. Tired of swallowing hurt for Ethan's sake. As dinner progressed, another uncomfortable moment arrived. One of Vanessa's friends approached my table. A woman named Kimberly. Friendly enough, At least on the surface. She sat beside me briefly. So, you're Ethan's mom? Yes. You must be proud. I am. She smiled, then asked the question. What do you do? I nearly laughed. I had answered this question hundreds of times. I own some event properties. Oh. Her interest immediately faded, exactly as Vanessa's had months earlier. She nodded politely, then turned toward another guest. Conversation over. I wasn't offended. I was fascinated. People constantly revealed themselves through small moments. And tonight seemed full of them. A little later, I excused myself and stepped outside. The evening air felt refreshing. The gardens glowed under soft lights. Music drifted through open doors. For a few peaceful minutes, I stood alone. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel. Of course. Thought I'd find you out here. I smiled. You know me too well. He joined me beside the fountain. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he said, You're handling this better than most people would. I laughed softly. I'm not sure that's a compliment. Maybe not. We watched the water for a moment. Then Daniel frowned. There's something else. That got my attention. What? He hesitated. Vanessa requested changes again this afternoon. My stomach tightened. What kind of changes? The wedding photographs. I turned toward him. What about them? He looked uncomfortable. She requested that certain family members appear less frequently. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. Which family members? Daniel sighed. You. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The words hung between us. Heavy, painful, embarrassing. Even after everything she'd done, that still hurt. Perhaps because photographs last forever. And apparently, Vanessa wanted as little evidence of my presence as possible. Daniel shook his head. I told the photography team to ignore the request. I looked at him. You did. They work for Hunter Estates. A faint smile appeared. And Hunter Estates works for you. For the first time all evening, I genuinely smiled. Thank you. You don't need to thank me. Maybe not. But I did anyway. Because loyalty matters. Because respect matters. Because kindness matters. Things Vanessa never seemed to understand. When we returned inside, the evening was nearing its end. Guests mingled around dessert tables. Conversations filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. One of the venue coordinators approached me. A young woman named Sarah. She had worked for Hunter Estates for 3 years. Long enough to know exactly who I was. Long enough to respect me. Unfortunately, she forgot the secret. The moment she saw me, she smiled. Mrs. Hunter. I immediately raised a hand. Her eyes widened. She realized her mistake. Too late. Several nearby guests had already heard, including Patricia, including Richard, including Vanessa. The room wasn't loud enough to hide it. Patricia turned toward Sarah. Mrs. Hunter. Sarah looked trapped, completely trapped. I stepped in immediately. Just an old habit. Sarah nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. The moment passed, at least on the surface. But I noticed something important. Patricia looked thoughtful. Richard looked confused. And Vanessa looked suspicious. Very suspicious. For the first time, I sensed cracks forming in the story she had created about me. Tiny cracks. Nothing more. But enough to make her wonder. Enough to make her question. Enough to make me realize the truth was getting harder to hide. Later that night, after most guests had left, I walked through the empty venue alone, past the gardens, past the ballroom, past the chandeliers I had personally selected years ago. Everything stood ready for tomorrow. For the wedding. For the confrontation I could increasingly feel approaching. And deep in my heart, I knew something else. Tomorrow would not unfold the way Vanessa expected. Because secrets have a way of surviving only until the exact moment they're needed. And mine was running out of time. I barely slept after the rehearsal dinner. Not because of the seating chart. Not because of Vanessa's comments. Not even because of the growing tension that seemed to surround every interaction. It was because something deep inside me felt unsettled. For months, I had ignored warning signs. For months, I had convinced myself that patience would solve everything. But as I lay awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something far worse than hurt feelings and social snobbery. I just didn't know how right that feeling was. The next day was the day before the wedding. Hunter Estates was buzzing with activity. Florists were delivering final arrangements. Caterers were confirming menus. Wedding coordinators were running through checklists. Every detail was being prepared for what Vanessa insisted would be the perfect day. Around noon, I stopped by one of the properties to review a few operational matters with Daniel. Although most of the wedding management team handled events independently, I still liked checking in before major occasions, especially when those occasions involved my family. Daniel met me in his office. "You look tired." I laughed softly. "That's because I am." He handed me a cup of coffee. "One more day." I nodded. One more day. At the time, neither of us knew how much those words would come to mean. We spent about an hour reviewing event logistics. Afterward, Daniel received a phone call and stepped away. I decided to take a walk around the property. The gardens looked beautiful. The weather forecast was perfect. Every pathway had been cleaned. Every flower bed looked pristine. The entire venue seemed ready for a fairy tale wedding. As I walked past one of the private event wings, I realized I'd left my reading glasses in a conference room earlier that morning. I turned down a quiet hallway toward the room. The area was mostly empty. Most staff were working elsewhere. As I approached the door, I heard voices. At first, I didn't pay attention. Then I heard Vanessa's name. Instinctively, I slowed. The conference room door wasn't completely closed. The voices inside became clearer. Vanessa and Patricia. I should have kept walking. I know that. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I wasn't looking for information. But then I heard my own name, and everything changed. Patricia laughed. "I'm telling you, once you're married, things will get easier." Vanessa sighed. "I hope so." "You've already done the hard part." I frowned. "Hard part," Vanessa spoke again. I just don't want her interfering forever. For a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. Her Patricia chuckled. Joyce, who else? My heart stopped. I stood frozen, completely motionless. Neither woman knew I was outside. Patricia lowered her voice. Ethan's attached to her. I know. Vanessa sounded irritated. That's the problem. The problem? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Patricia laughed again. Once you're married, priorities change. They better. Vanessa's voice sharpened. I'm not spending the next 20 years competing with his mother. The words struck me like a physical blow. Competing, I had never competed with her. Not once. I had spent months trying to welcome her, trying to understand her, trying to support Ethan's happiness. Yet somehow, she viewed me as competition. Inside the room, Patricia continued. Most men eventually choose their wives. I know. Especially after children. Vanessa sighed dramatically. I just need more distance. The knot in my stomach tightened. Distance. From me. Patricia's chair creaked. What about the house? I frowned. What house? Then Vanessa answered. That's another thing. I felt my pulse quicken. Ethan still talks about helping her maintain it. Patricia scoffed. That's ridiculous. I agree. Vanessa sounded annoyed. He acts like it's some sacred family landmark. My hands began trembling. The house they were discussing wasn't just property. It was my home. The place where Michael and I had built our life. The place where Ethan grew up. The place filled with decades of memories. Patricia laughed. Eventually, you'll convince him. I hope so. Sell it. My breath caught. Sell it. Vanessa responded immediately. That's exactly what I've been saying. The hallway suddenly felt too small, too hot, too suffocating. Patricia continued. Once the house is sold, she won't need all that space. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Maybe an assisted living community would be best. Silence filled the room. For a second, I desperately hoped Vanessa would object. I hoped she would laugh and say that was ridiculous, cruel, unnecessary. Instead, she said something far worse. Honestly, that would solve a lot of problems. I felt the air leave my lungs. The world seemed to tilt. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. After everything, after every sacrifice, after every year spent raising Ethan alone, after every night I stayed awake worrying about him, this woman viewed me as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to remove, an inconvenience inside the room. Patricia lowered her voice again. What matters is protecting your future. I know. Once you're married, your household comes first. Vanessa laughed. And I definitely don't want his mother around forever. The words echoed through my mind, over and over. I don't want his mother around forever. For a moment, all the previous insults suddenly made sense. The comments, the exclusion, the coldness, the judgment. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been misunderstanding. Vanessa didn't simply dislike me. She wanted me gone. Completely, quietly, permanently removed from Ethan's life. I stepped away from the door before they could hear me. My legs felt weak. I walked aimlessly through the hallway, then outside, then farther into the gardens. I don't remember where I went exactly. I only remember sitting on a bench near one of the fountains, staring at the water, trying to process what I'd heard. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to storm into that room and confront them immediately. Instead, I sat there in silence. Several minutes later, Melissa found me. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What's happened? I looked at her. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then everything came pouring out. Every word, every sentence, every cruel plan. Melissa listened quietly. The more she heard, the angrier she became. When I finished, she looked ready to explode. I knew it. I shook my head. I didn't. Aunt Joyce. I kept making excuses. Melissa sat beside me. You wanted to believe the best. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had. For too long. We sat in silence. Finally, she asked, "What are you going to do?" The question lingered in the air. I honestly didn't know. Part of me wanted to tell Ethan immediately. Part of me wanted to expose everything. Part of me wanted to cancel the wedding myself. But another part of me needed certainty, needed truth, needed Ethan to see things clearly, not through anger, not through manipulation, through reality. I looked across the gardens toward the grand ballroom, toward the venue everyone admired so much, toward the buildings I had spent decades creating. Then I quietly said, "I'm going to wait." Melissa stared at me. For what? I took a slow breath. For them to reveal who they really are. At the time, neither of us knew that moment was less than 24 hours away. And when it arrived, it would happen in front of everyone. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather. Of course it did. The sky was clear. The air was warm. Not a single cloud threatened the horizon. It was exactly the kind of day brides dream about, the kind of day wedding planners pray for, the kind of day that appears in glossy magazines. Yet when I opened my eyes that morning, the beauty outside my window felt strangely disconnected from the storm inside my heart. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vanessa's voice again. I don't want his mother around forever. The sentence haunted me. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. For months, I had questioned my instincts, questioned my judgment, questioned whether I was imagining things. Now there was no doubt. I knew exactly how Vanessa felt. The only question remaining was whether Ethan knew, or whether he had been blinded by love. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes before standing. The house was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. For a moment, I found myself staring at an old photograph hanging near the dining room. Michael, Ethan, and me, taken nearly 25 years earlier. Ethan couldn't have been more than 10. We were standing in front of this very house, smiling, laughing, happy. I touched the frame gently. Wish you were here today. Michael. The words escaped before I realized I was speaking aloud, not because I needed someone to solve my problems, just because I missed him. There are certain days when the absence of a loved one feels larger than usual. This was one of those days. A few hours later, Melissa arrived. She carried 2 coffees, one for herself, one for me, the same way she always did when she knew I was struggling. She walked inside without knocking. Family privilege. How are you holding up? I accepted the coffee. I've been better. Melissa sat across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she asked the question both of us had been avoiding. Are you still going? I looked up. To the wedding? She nodded. I took a slow sip of coffee. Yes. You don't owe them that. I'm not doing it for them. Then who? I smiled sadly. Ethan. The answer came immediately, without hesitation, because despite everything that had happened, despite every insult and humiliation, I still loved my son. That had never changed. It never would. Melissa sighed. You're a better person than I am. I laughed softly. No. You are. She shook her head. If someone spoke about me the way Vanessa spoke about you, I'd expose everything before breakfast. For the first time that morning, I genuinely smiled. That was exactly what Melissa would do. And honestly, part of me wished I shared that instinct. But another part knew this wasn't about revenge. It never had been. I wasn't trying to destroy Vanessa. I simply wanted the truth to reveal itself. Eventually, naturally, completely. By late morning, I began getting ready. Unlike most mothers of the groom, I wasn't surrounded by stylists. There was no glam squad, no private dressing suite, no elaborate preparations. Just me, a quiet bedroom, and a navy blue dress hanging in my closet. I had purchased it months earlier. Simple, elegant, timeless. The kind of dress Michael would have liked. As I fastened a pair of pearl earrings, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For a brief moment, I hardly recognized myself. Not physically, emotionally. The woman staring back looked tired, stronger than she felt, older than she was. Yet there was something else there too. Resolve. A quiet determination. For months, I had endured disrespect. Today, that would end, one way or another. Around noon, my phone rang. Daniel. Good morning, Mrs. Hunter. I smiled. Good morning, Daniel. Everything is ready. I know it is. There was a pause. Then he lowered his voice. Are you sure you're okay? The concern in his tone touched me. I'll survive. Daniel didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. Before ending the call, he added something unexpected. Whatever happens today, you're not alone. I felt my throat tighten. Thank you. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several moments. Sometimes, support arrives in the simplest forms. A phone call, a kind word, a reminder that someone sees what you're carrying. Daniel had given me that reminder, and I needed it. By early afternoon, guests had begun arriving at Hunter Estates. Luxury cars filled the parking areas. Valets moved efficiently between entrances. Photographers prepared equipment. Florists made final adjustments. The property looked magnificent. As I drove through the main entrance gates, a wave of memories hit me. I remembered buying the land. I remembered planting the first gardens. I remembered worrying whether I'd lose everything. I remembered standing alone in unfinished ballrooms late at night. Dreaming, building, believing. Now those dreams surrounded me from every direction. Yet very few people present understood that. Most guests simply saw a beautiful venue. They didn't know the story behind it, just as they didn't know the story behind me. I parked near a private entrance and stepped out of the car. Immediately, several staff members noticed me. Years of training kept them professional, but I still saw the recognition in their eyes. Respect, affection, loyalty. One young employee approached. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hunter?" Then immediately corrected herself. "Sorry, Joyce." I smiled. "It's okay." She looked relieved. The secret had become increasingly difficult to maintain. But everyone understood my wishes. At least for now. As I entered the property, I noticed something interesting. Staff members treated me differently than guests did. Not because of wealth, because of history. They knew how hard I'd worked. Many had been with Hunter Estates for years. Some for decades. They had watched the business grow, watched me grow. They knew the woman behind the title. That meant more to me than any balance sheet ever could. A few minutes later, I spotted Ethan. He stood near the ceremony garden, speaking with several groomsmen. The moment he saw me, his face brightened, the same way it always had, at least for a second. "Mom." He walked over and hugged me. A real hug. Not rushed, not distracted, not obligatory. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The tension, the wedding, the uncertainty. It was just my son. The little boy who once promised to take care of me. The young man I had raised. The child I would always love. "You look beautiful," he said. I smiled. "So do you." He laughed. "That's not usually what people say to the groom." "It should be." For a few minutes we talked. Really talked. Like old times. And during those minutes, I saw flashes of the Ethan I knew. The Ethan who was kind. The Ethan who cared. The Ethan who hadn't yet learned how destructive silence could be. Then Vanessa appeared. Everything changed immediately. Not dramatically, subtly, but unmistakably. Her smile froze slightly when she saw me. The warmth vanished from Ethan's expression. Not because of me, because he sensed tension. Again, always tension. "Joyce." Her greeting sounded polite. Technically, I smiled. "Vanessa." She glanced at my dress, at my pearls, at my shoes, evaluating, judging, the way she always did. Then she forced a smile. "I'm glad you made it." The sentence sounded less welcoming than intended, as though my attendance had been uncertain, as though my presence required approval. Before I could answer, a wedding coordinator approached Vanessa with a question. She immediately turned away. Conversation over. Dismissed. Just like that, I watched her walk away. And for the first time since hearing her conversation with Patricia, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness. Clarity. Crystal clear clarity. Because once someone reveals who they truly are, confusion disappears. You stop making excuses. You stop searching for explanations. You simply see reality. And standing there, in the afternoon sunlight of my own venue, I finally saw everything clearly. The wedding ceremony was only a few hours away. The guests were arriving. The champagne was chilling. The photographers were preparing. The perfect day was unfolding exactly as planned, at least on the surface. But beneath that perfect surface, cracks were already spreading. And before the evening ended, those cracks would split wide open. The ceremony itself was beautiful, painfully beautiful. The kind of wedding people talk about for years afterward. Sunlight poured across the ceremony garden. White roses lined the aisle. A string quartet played softly beneath the trees. Nearly 300 guests filled the rows of elegant seating. Everything looked perfect. And somehow, that made what happened next even worse. As I sat in the front row, I found myself wondering how many people around me were seeing the real story. Probably none. To everyone else, this was a fairy tale. A handsome groom, a beautiful bride, a luxurious venue, a perfect beginning. Only a handful of us knew how many cracks existed beneath the surface. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Ethan stood at the altar looking nervous and emotional. Vanessa looked radiant in her designer gown. Guests smiled. Several cried. The vows were exchanged. The rings followed. Applause erupted when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. I clapped too. Because despite everything, I still hoped. Maybe foolishly, maybe desperately, but part of me still hoped. The reception began shortly afterward inside the grand ballroom. The room looked magnificent. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Elegant floral arrangements filled every table. Music drifted through hidden speakers. Guests mingled happily. Champagne glasses clinked. Laughter echoed everywhere. For a little while, the evening almost felt normal. Almost. I spent much of the cocktail hour speaking with relatives. Many hadn't seen me in years. Others had traveled long distances. It felt good to reconnect. For a brief period, I allowed myself to relax. Then the family photo session began, and everything changed. The photographer gathered relatives near the ballroom staircase. One group at a time, parents, grandparents, siblings, friends. The process was slow but organized. Eventually, someone called for immediate family. I walked toward the staircase. As I approached, I immediately noticed Vanessa's expression. Annoyance. Not unusual, but stronger than before. She was already stressed. The day had not gone perfectly. A flower arrangement had arrived late. One bridesmaid had misplaced her bouquet. The wedding coordinator had needed to adjust the reception timeline. Small issues. Normal issues. But Vanessa seemed determined to treat every inconvenience like a catastrophe. I quietly took my place near Ethan. The photographer smiled. Perfect. Then he adjusted a few positions. Can everyone move slightly closer? People shifted. Someone stepped backward. Someone stepped forward. The usual chaos of large family photographs. As I moved, the heel of my shoe caught slightly on the edge of a decorative platform. I stumbled. Not dramatically. Just enough to lose balance for a moment. Instinctively, I reached out. My hand brushed the side of Vanessa's gown. A tiny mark appeared near the lower hem. Nothing serious, barely noticeable. Certainly nothing that couldn't be cleaned in seconds. The photographer immediately said, "It's okay. No problem." One bridesmaid grabbed a cloth. Another offered assistance. The issue should have ended there. Instead, Vanessa exploded. "What is wrong with you?" The entire staircase went silent. I froze. For a second, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Her face had turned red with anger. Several guests stared. The photographer looked horrified. "Vanessa," Ethan said quietly. But she wasn't listening. She looked directly at me. Not at the dress, not at the stain, at me. Months of frustration seemed to pour out of her all at once. "I knew this would happen." The room became so quiet that I could hear the fountain outside through the ballroom windows. I stood perfectly still, trying to understand what was happening. Then came the moment I will never forget. The moment that changed everything. Vanessa pointed toward me and said loudly, "Could someone move this pig away from the photos?" Silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels physical. The kind that crushes the air from a room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. I stared at her. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I genuinely couldn't believe what I had just heard. A pig. In front of nearly 300 guests. At my son's wedding. Inside the venue I owned. The photographer looked horrified. Several bridesmaids gasped. One older relative covered her mouth. Across the room, Melissa immediately stood up. I could see fury in her eyes. Pure fury. But before she could say anything, I looked toward Ethan, and what happened next hurt even more. He froze, completely froze. Shock filled his face, embarrassment, confusion, disbelief, but no action, no words, no defense. Nothing. For several endless seconds, my son simply stood there. And in that moment, my heart broke. Not because Vanessa insulted me, because Ethan didn't stop her. The little boy who once promised to take care of me. The young man I had sacrificed everything for. The son I loved more than life itself. Stood silent. I knew he was shocked. I knew he hadn't expected it. But silence still hurts, especially when it comes from someone you love, around us. Whispers began spreading. Guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Some appeared angry. Others appeared embarrassed. Vanessa finally seemed to realize what she had done. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "It's my wedding day." Nobody responded. "I've been dealing with problems all day." Still nobody responded, because everyone understood the truth. A stain wasn't the issue. The dress wasn't the issue. The issue was that Vanessa had finally revealed who she really was, and she had done it publicly. I took a slow breath, then another. The strange thing was that I didn't feel angry. At least not immediately. What I felt was clarity. The same clarity I'd experienced earlier that day. Everything suddenly made sense. The comments, the exclusion, the judgment, the conversation I overheard, the months of disrespect. The mask was gone, completely gone. And now, everyone could see what I had seen. Finally, I looked around the room. Hundreds of eyes stared back. Then I looked at Vanessa. She still didn't understand. Not really. She thought this moment was about a dress, about photographs, about a wedding. She had no idea what she had actually done, no idea what she had just revealed, and certainly no idea where she was standing. I turned toward Ethan. For a moment, our eyes met. His face looked devastated, like someone waking from a dream, like someone realizing a terrible mistake. I almost felt sorry for him, almost, without saying a single word. I stepped away from the staircase. The room remained silent. No one stopped me. No one spoke. My heels clicked softly against the ballroom floor as I walked toward the exit, past the tables, past the guests, past the flowers I had personally approved months earlier. Behind me, I could hear whispers growing louder, questions spreading, confusion building. But I never looked back, because for the first time all day, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not scream, not argue, not seek revenge. Just tell the truth. And the truth was waiting only a few doors away, inside the management office of Hunter Estates, the office where everyone knew exactly who I was. The moment I stepped out of the ballroom, I felt hundreds of eyes following me. Whispers trailed behind me like shadows. The insult had spread through the reception in seconds. People who hadn't even been near the staircase already knew something had happened. That's the thing about weddings. News travels faster than music, faster than champagne, faster than truth. I kept walking, not rushing, not crying, not making a scene. My heels clicked steadily against the polished floor as I crossed the hallway toward the administrative wing of Hunter Estates. The same hallway I had walked thousands of times over the past 20 years. Only this time, everything felt different. Because I wasn't walking away from humiliation. I was walking toward the truth. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Melissa. Of course. She caught up quickly. Aunt Joyce! I stopped. The anger in her eyes startled even me. If you tell me not to say anything, I'm not listening. Despite everything, I almost smiled. Melissa. No. She shook her head. I'm serious. Her voice trembled with rage. She called you a pig. I remained silent. After everything you've done. Melissa. No. Tears filled her eyes. Do you know how hard it was not to scream at her? For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I gently squeezed her hand. I know. The simple words seemed to calm her slightly. Not much, but enough. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked toward the office doors ahead. Nothing dramatic. Melissa laughed bitterly. I think we've moved past dramatic. Maybe she was right. because what was about to happen would change everything. Not through revenge, through reality. We reached the management office. The moment I opened the door, something remarkable happened. Every employee inside immediately stood up. Every single one, receptionists, coordinators, managers, assistants, all of them. The room fell silent. Then one by one, they greeted me. "Good evening, Mrs. Hunter. Mrs. Hunter. Good to see you, Mrs. Hunter." The respect was automatic, natural, unforced, because this was their workplace, and they knew exactly who I was. Melissa glanced around. Even she looked slightly overwhelmed. Not because she didn't know the truth, because seeing it was different from knowing it. At that exact moment, Daniel stepped out of his office. The instant he saw me, his expression changed. Concern, respect, understanding. He immediately crossed the room. "Mrs. Hunter." I smiled softly. "Hello, Daniel." Then something happened that neither of us expected. Several wedding guests had followed us. Not intentionally at first. Curiosity simply pulled them in our direction. A few relatives, a few friends. Several members of Vanessa's family, and most importantly, Ethan. I didn't notice him immediately, but he was there, standing near the doorway, watching, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Daniel noticed him too. His eyes widened slightly. The secret was about to become impossible to hide. The office grew quiet. Everyone seemed frozen, waiting, watching, trying to piece together a puzzle. One guest finally spoke. A middle-aged man I vaguely recognized from Vanessa's side of the family. He pointed toward me. "Why is everyone calling her Mrs. Hunter?" Nobody answered. The silence only deepened. Then Patricia appeared, followed closely by Richard. Both looked unsettled. Neither looked pleased. And behind them, Vanessa. For the first time all evening, she appeared genuinely nervous. Not angry, not annoyed, nervous. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. She could feel it, even if she didn't yet understand it. Daniel looked toward me, waiting, asking permission without words. I gave the slightest nod. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Daniel spoke, calmly, professionally, respectfully. "Mrs. Hunter, would you like to use the conference room?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Patricia frowned. Richard looked confused. Vanessa stared. Ethan looked completely lost. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. "Mom." I turned toward him. His face was pale. "What is going on?" The sadness in his voice nearly broke my heart. Because despite everything, he genuinely didn't know. Not yet. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly. "I think it's time you learned something." The room became silent again. Daniel opened the conference room doors. Everyone followed, some out of concern, others out of curiosity, most out of disbelief. Within minutes, Nearly 20 people had gathered inside. The atmosphere felt surreal. Outside, a wedding reception continued. Music played. Guests danced. Champagne flowed. Inside this room, an entirely different event was unfolding. The truth. I sat at the head of the conference table. Not because I wanted authority, because that's where Daniel always placed me during business meetings. Old habits, years of routine. Daniel remained standing nearby. Melissa sat beside me. Ethan stood across from us. Vanessa remained close to Patricia and Richard, like someone seeking protection. The silence stretched. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Mom." I looked up. "What is this?" The hurt in his eyes was impossible to ignore. I wish things were different. I wished this conversation wasn't happening at his wedding. I wished 1,000 things, but wishes don't change reality. So I answered, "How much do you know about Hunter Estates?" Confusion crossed his face. "The venue." "Yes." He glanced around. "What about it?" I smiled sadly. Then I asked another question. "Do you remember the first property I bought after your father died?" His expression softened slightly. "The old event hall." "Yes." "You worked there." "I did." "You renovated it." "I did." He frowned. Slowly. Very slowly. Something began connecting inside his mind. Tiny pieces, scattered fragments, half-forgotten memories, questions he had never asked, answers he had never needed. The room remained completely silent. Then Daniel stepped forward and finally spoke the words that changed everything. "Mr. Hunter." He paused. "Your mother is the founder and owner of Hunter Estates." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The sentence seemed to freeze the room. Ethan stared. Patricia blinked repeatedly. Richard looked shocked. And Vanessa went completely white. For several seconds. No one reacted. Because sometimes the human mind needs time to process impossible information. Finally, Ethan laughed nervously. "What? Nobody joined him. Because nobody was joking." His eyes moved from Daniel to me, then back again. "What do you mean?" Daniel's voice remained calm. "Your mother owns Hunter Estates." Silence, again, heavy, crushing, unavoidable. The realization slowly spread across Ethan's face. Disbelief, confusion, shock, then understanding. Little by little, piece by piece, memory after memory, everything suddenly fit together. The years, the business trips, the properties, the meetings, the staff, the relationships, the success, all of it. And for the first time in his life, he saw the full picture. Across the room, Patricia looked physically ill. Richard appeared stunned. But nobody looked worse than Vanessa. Her entire world had shifted in less than 30 seconds. The woman she had spent months belittling. The woman she had called simple. The woman she had called a pig. The woman she had desperately wanted removed from Ethan's life. Owned every acre surrounding them. Every ballroom, every garden, every chandelier, every brick, every contract, every reservation. everything. And deep down, I think she realized something else, something even worse. The issue was never the money. The issue was what her behavior revealed before she knew the money existed. And there was no way to take that back, no way to erase it, no way to hide it. The truth was finally standing in the room with all of us. And it wasn't finished speaking yet. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after Daniel revealed the truth. The silence felt almost unreal. Heavy, stunned, absolute. I watched the reactions spread around the room, one face at a time. Shock has a strange way of moving through people. First confusion, then disbelief, then realization, then embarrassment. Lots and lots of embarrassment. Ethan was the first to find his voice. He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. Mom. The word came out barely above a whisper. I smiled sadly. Yes. You own Hunter Estates. I nodded. His eyes widened again, even though he'd already heard the answer, even though Daniel had already confirmed it. Part of him still couldn't believe it. All of it. A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats. Daniel answered before I could. Every property. The room grew even quieter. If that was somehow possible. I noticed Richard Caldwell slowly lowering himself into a chair. The color had drained from his face. Patricia looked equally shaken. Months of assumptions had just collapsed in front of her. And Vanessa. Vanessa looked terrified, not embarrassed. Terrified. Because unlike everyone else, she wasn't simply processing new information. She was remembering old behavior. Every insult, every comment, every judgment, every cruel little moment she thought carried no consequences. One by one, I could practically see the memories passing through her mind. Then Ethan looked at me again and asked the question I had known was coming. Why didn't you tell me? There was no anger in his voice, only confusion, pain, regret. I took a slow breath, because the answer mattered, not just for him, for everyone. I never hid it from you. He frowned. What? You knew I owned venues. Not like this. No. I nodded. Not like this. The distinction mattered. I had never lied. I simply hadn't advertised. I looked around the room, then back at my son. When your father died, I promised myself something. Ethan remained silent. I promised I would raise you to value people, not money. The room listened. No one interrupted. I wanted you to build your own life. I did. You did. I smiled. And I'm proud of that. For the first time, tears appeared in Ethan's eyes. Real tears. Not from embarrassment, from understanding. Slowly, painfully, understanding. I didn't want wealth becoming your identity, I continued. So I never treated it like one. The room remained silent. Then Melissa quietly added, That's because Aunt Joyce never needed money to prove who she was. A few heads nodded, especially among the staff. People who had known me for years. People who understood. Then Richard finally spoke. His voice sounded different now, smaller somehow. You built all this yourself. I looked at him. Not alone. I smiled toward Daniel. And not quickly. A faint laugh moved through the room, breaking some of the tension. But only a little. Because the real issue still stood across from me. Vanessa. For months, she had judged me based on what she thought I possessed. Now she sat motionless, unable to hide her panic. Finally, she stood. Everyone turned toward her, including me. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to speak. Then she forced a smile, a familiar smile, the same fake smile she always used. Only now it looked desperate. Joyce. I remained silent. She swallowed. I didn't know. There it was. The sentence, the defense, the excuse. I had expected it, maybe even prepared for it, but hearing it still disappointed me, because it revealed exactly what she thought the problem was. Money, not behavior, not respect, not character. Money. I looked at her calmly. No. She nodded quickly. No, I really didn't. Again. Silence. Then I asked a simple question. One question. The only question that mattered. What would have changed? The room froze. Vanessa blinked. What would have changed if you knew? She opened her mouth, then closed it. No answer. Because there wasn't one. Or at least, not one she could say aloud. I leaned back slightly. Still calm. Still composed. If you knew I owned Hunter Estates. I paused. Would you have treated me differently? The question hit her like a hammer. Everyone in the room understood why. Because the answer was obvious. Painfully obvious. Of course she would have. That's exactly the problem. Vanessa looked toward Ethan. Looking for support. Looking for rescue. Looking for something. But Ethan wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the floor. Then she tried again. I was stressed. Nobody responded. It was my wedding day. Still nothing. I didn't mean pig, Melissa interrupted sharply. The room froze again. Melissa stood. Her eyes burned with anger. You called her a pig. Vanessa immediately looked away. Because there was no defending it. No explaining it. No rebranding it. No rewriting it. The word existed. Everyone heard it. Everyone remembered it. Patricia finally stepped forward. Protective mother mode. I think emotions are high. Melissa laughed. Actually laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. Emotions. Patricia straightened. People make mistakes. I looked toward Patricia, then spoke for the first time in several minutes. You're right. Everyone turned toward me. I nodded slowly. People do make mistakes. The room relaxed slightly. Then I continued. But mistakes reveal character. Silence. Again, beautiful silence. The kind silence that arrives when truth enters a room. I stood, slowly, not dramatically, just enough to meet everyone's eyes. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. For months, I thought I was imagining things. Her face tightened. The comments. Silence. The judgments. More silence. The exclusion. No response. The disrespect. Vanessa looked down. I continued. Then yesterday, I overheard a conversation. That got everyone's attention, especially Vanessa's, especially Patricia's. The fear in their eyes appeared instantly. And suddenly, I knew. They already understood what I was about to say. I looked directly at them. I heard you discussing my future. The room became deathly still. Patricia's face went pale. Vanessa looked physically ill. I continued calmly. You talked about selling my home. Nobody moved. You talked about moving me into assisted living. A sharp gasp escaped someone near the back. I wasn't sure who. Maybe Ethan's aunt. Maybe one of Vanessa's relatives. It didn't matter, because the room had already changed. Completely. Then I said the sentence that shattered whatever defense remained. And you called me a problem. Ethan's head snapped upward. Immediately. What? His voice cracked. I turned toward him. The pain on his face nearly broke me. But the truth had to come out. All of it. I heard everything. The room remained frozen. Then Ethan slowly turned toward Vanessa. His expression had changed. Gone was the confusion. Gone was the uncertainty. Gone was the shock. In its place stood something much harder. Recognition. The kind that arrives when someone finally sees reality. What is she talking about? Vanessa didn't answer. Vanessa. Still nothing. His voice grew firmer. What is she talking about? Tears finally appeared in Vanessa's eyes. But something felt different. Not remorse. Fear. Because for the first time since I'd met her, the audience she cared so much about wasn't admiring her anymore. They were seeing her. And those are very different things. For several seconds after Ethan asked Vanessa his question, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe. The room had become a courtroom without a judge. A place where the truth sat in plain sight, and everyone was waiting to see who would acknowledge it first. Ethan stood in the center of it all. His eyes never left Vanessa. What is she talking about? His voice was stronger this time. More demanding. More certain. For months, I'd watched my son avoid conflict. I'd watched him smooth over problems. I'd watched him explain away behavior that should never have needed explaining. For the first time, he wasn't looking for an excuse. He was looking for an answer. And Vanessa knew it. She wiped at her eyes. It's not what it sounds like. The moment she said it, I saw Ethan's expression change. Because everyone knows that phrase. Everyone. It's the phrase people use when they don't have a better defense. Patricia immediately stepped forward. Vanessa didn't mean, please don't. Ethan's voice stopped her. Not loud, not angry, but firm. The room became even quieter. I couldn't remember ever hearing him speak to Patricia that way before. Then he looked back at Vanessa. Did you say those things? She hesitated. Too long. Far too long. And in that hesitation, everyone found their answer. Especially Ethan. His shoulders dropped slightly. The way they do when hope begins leaving a person. Finally, Vanessa whispered, "I was frustrated." The words echoed through the room. Not denial, not correction, just justification. Frustrated. I watched Ethan close his eyes. Briefly, painfully. Then he opened them again. "Did you call my mother a problem?" Vanessa looked away. Silence. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. Then came the answer. Sometimes. The room collectively exhaled. Not because anyone was surprised, because hearing it aloud made it real. I saw Ethan physically flinch, as though the word itself had struck him. And suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was simply sad. Because this wasn't the conversation anyone should be having on their wedding day. Least of all, my son. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Ethan slowly turned toward me. The pain in his face nearly broke my heart. "Mom," I met his eyes. "I'm sorry." The room fell silent again. My son had always been a good man. Flawed. Human. Too willing to avoid confrontation. But good. And in that moment, I saw the little boy I'd raised. Not the confused groom, not the conflicted fiancé. Just Ethan, my son. Tears filled his eyes. I should have listened. I shook my head gently. "Ethan, no." His voice cracked. "I saw things." More tears appeared. I just kept convincing myself they weren't important. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Everyone knew this wasn't really about Vanessa anymore. This was about a son confronting himself. I thought I was keeping the peace. His voice grew quieter. But I wasn't. I felt tears threatening my own eyes. Because he finally understood. Not the money. Not the venue. The real issue. Silence. The kind that enables cruelty. The kind that allows disrespect to grow. The kind that tells someone their behavior is acceptable, even when it isn't. Then something unexpected happened. I stood, slowly, quietly, and walked toward him. Every eye followed. I stopped directly in front of my son, then placed my hand on his cheek, the same way I had when he was a little boy, the same way I had after scraped knees, after broken hearts, after difficult days. "Ethan," his eyes met mine. "You made mistakes." A tear rolled down his face. I smiled gently. "So did I." Confusion crossed his expression. "You?" I nodded. "I kept hoping things would change." The room listened. I kept making excuses. I glanced briefly toward Vanessa, then back to Ethan. I should have trusted my instincts sooner. Nobody spoke. because everyone understood. This wasn't a speech about blame. It was a conversation about truth. Then I stepped back, and for the first time since the revelation began, I addressed everyone in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, simply honestly. I don't care about the money. A few people shifted uncomfortably, probably because they had assumed otherwise. I continued. I never cared. My gaze moved around the room, landing briefly on Patricia, then Richard, then Vanessa. The reason today hurts isn't because someone insulted a wealthy woman. Silence. The reason today hurts is because someone insulted another human being. Nobody could argue with that. Nobody tried, because that was the truth. The simplest truth of all. I looked directly at Vanessa for several seconds. Neither of us spoke. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. Something that surprised even me. I would have welcomed you. Fresh tears filled her eyes. The room remained silent. I tried to welcome you. Her shoulders trembled. I wanted you to become family. I meant every word, every single one. Because despite everything that had happened, it was true. The saddest part wasn't that she'd hurt me. The saddest part was that none of it had been necessary. Then I continued. You never had to impress me. Silence. You never had to compete with me. More silence. You never had to remove me from Ethan's life. At that, Vanessa finally broke. Not dramatically, not theatrically, quietly. She lowered her head and began crying. Real crying. The kind without performance, the kind without strategy, the kind people can't control. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the conversation outside the conference room. The plans, the manipulation, the cruelty. Compassion didn't erase accountability. It never should. Across the room, Daniel stood quietly watching. Melissa sat with tears in her eyes. Several relatives looked emotional. Even some of Vanessa's family appeared ashamed. Then Ethan spoke again. His voice sounded stronger than before, clearer, more certain. He looked directly at Vanessa and asked the question everyone had been waiting for, the question nobody else could answer. Do you love me? The room froze, completely, because suddenly everything else became secondary. The venue, the money, the insults, the wedding, all of it. This was the real issue, the only issue that truly mattered. Do you love me? Vanessa looked up slowly. Her mascara had begun to run. Tears streaked her face, but she didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation terrified me, because genuine love rarely needs time to identify itself. Seconds passed. Then more. The silence grew unbearable, and for the first time all evening, I realized something. The biggest twist of this story had not happened yet. It was still coming. And when it arrived, it would determine whether this wedding survived the night. The question hung in the room like a thundercloud. Do you love me? Ethan's voice had not been loud. It didn't need to be. Every person present understood the weight behind it, because after everything that had been revealed, after every lie, every insult, every hidden conversation, only one thing truly mattered. Love. Real love. The kind that survives when status disappears. The kind that exists before money enters the room. The kind that remains when nobody is watching. Vanessa stared at Ethan. Tears streamed down her face, but she still didn't answer. And that silence terrified everyone, especially Ethan. I watched my son's face carefully. For months, I had seen confusion, conflict, denial, but what I saw now was something different. A man desperately hoping the woman he had chosen would give him a reason to stay, a reason to believe, a reason to fight for their future. The room waited. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then Vanessa finally spoke. Of course I love you. But something was wrong. Everyone felt it. The answer arrived too late, too rehearsed, too incomplete. Ethan noticed too. His shoulders remained tense. His expression didn't soften. He simply stood there, waiting. Vanessa continued. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Still nothing. No reaction. Because the words themselves weren't enough anymore. Not after everything. Then Ethan asked another question, one that cut much deeper. Would you have married me if I worked a normal job? The room froze. Again, Vanessa blinked. What? You heard me. His voice was steady now, painfully steady. If I wasn't successful, silence. If I didn't earn what I earn, more silence. If my mother owned nothing, Vanessa swallowed. Hard. I watched panic flash across her face. Because this was the question she never expected. Not whether she loved him. Whether she loved him enough without everything attached to him. The distinction mattered, and everyone knew it. Finally, she answered. That's not fair. The moment she said it, Ethan lowered his eyes. Not dramatically, not angrily, just sadly. Because that wasn't an answer. And he knew it. So did everyone else. For the first time all evening, Richard Caldwell spoke. Vanessa. His voice sounded unusually serious. She looked toward him. What? He sighed heavily, then said something that surprised the entire room. Answer the question. Vanessa stared at him. Apparently, she had expected support. Instead, she found disappointment. Richard rubbed his forehead. I've spent my entire life building businesses. The room listened. I understand ambition. He glanced briefly toward me, then toward Ethan. But ambition and character aren't the same thing. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Because Richard looked genuinely ashamed. Ashamed of his daughter's behavior. Ashamed of his own blindness. Ashamed of the assumptions he'd made. Then he looked directly at Vanessa. Answer him honestly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa collapsed into a chair. The fight left her. Completely. Gone was the confident bride. Gone was the social climber. Gone was the carefully crafted image. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked vulnerable, human, and very, very lost. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried across the room. I don't know. The room went silent. Again. But this silence felt different. Not shocking, heartbreaking. Ethan stared at her. What? Fresh tears appeared? I don't know. The words echoed through the room. Raw, ugly, honest, and honesty, even painful honesty, carries power. Vanessa covered her face. Then everything came pouring out. I loved how confident you were. Tears. I loved how successful you were. More tears. I loved the life we could have. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She continued. I loved how people respected you. A painful pause. Then the sentence that finally broke my heart. I don't know where those things end and where love begins. Silence. Absolute silence. Because nobody expected that answer. Not even me. Especially not Ethan. I watched his face carefully. The devastation was immediate. Not because she admitted being drawn to his success. Most people are attracted to qualities like stability and ambition. That's normal. What shattered him was that she couldn't separate those things from him. She didn't know where the man ended and the advantages began. And if she didn't know, how could she truly love him? Several moments passed. Then Ethan sat down, slowly, like a man carrying enormous weight. For a while, nobody spoke. Then he looked toward me. The sadness in his eyes was overwhelming. I'm sorry, Mom. Again, the second apology. This one deeper than the first. I shook my head gently. Ethan. No. He wiped his eyes. You saw this before I did. The truth of that statement hurt because I had and because he knew it. Then he laughed softly, a broken laugh. I thought I was protecting everyone. I remained silent. He continued. I was really protecting myself. The room listened quietly. I didn't want conflict. Another pause. So I ignored things. A longer pause. I ignored too much. For the first time all evening, nobody could argue with him, because everyone had watched it happen. Then Ethan stood again and turned toward Vanessa, the woman he'd planned to spend the rest of his life with. The woman standing in a wedding dress only a few hours after saying her vows. The woman who looked utterly defeated. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then Ethan spoke. Softly, calmly, decisively. I can't do this. A gasp moved through the room. Vanessa froze. What? His voice remained steady. I can't build a marriage on uncertainty. Fresh tears rolled down her face. Ethan, no. Not angry, not cruel, just firm. The firmness of someone who had finally found clarity. You should know whether you love me. Silence. You shouldn't have to think about it. More silence. You shouldn't have to calculate it. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Ethan delivered the final sentence. The sentence that ended everything. I think we both need to figure out who we are before we try building a life together. Vanessa stared at him, completely shattered. But deep down, I think she knew he was right, because for the first time all day, she didn't argue. She didn't manipulate. She didn't deflect. She simply cried. Across the room, Patricia quietly sat beside her daughter, not defending her, not excusing her, just holding her hand. Perhaps for the first time, she too understood what had happened. This wasn't about wealth. This wasn't about status. This wasn't even about the wedding. It was about values. And values always reveal themselves eventually. The reception music still echoed faintly through the building. Guests still filled the ballroom. Champagne still sat on tables. The wedding still existed, but the marriage no longer did. And standing there in the conference room of Hunter Estates, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't victorious. I was simply sad. Because sometimes emotional justice arrives wrapped in heartbreak. And tomorrow morning, every single person in this room would wake up with a life that looked very different than the one they expected. The conference room remained quiet long after Ethan ended the engagement. No one knew what to say. What words could possibly fit a moment like that? Only a few hours earlier. Everyone had arrived expecting a wedding reception, a celebration, a beginning. Instead, they had witnessed something entirely different. The collapse of an illusion, the exposure of hidden motives, the painful birth of truth. Vanessa sat motionless in her chair. Patricia remained beside her. Richard stood near the wall, staring at the floor. For the first time since I'd met them, none of the Caldwells seemed concerned with appearances. Status had disappeared. Image had disappeared. Only reality remained. And reality is often far less comfortable than performance. Ethan stood quietly across the room. His wedding jacket hung open. His tie was loosened. His shoulders looked heavy, not because he regretted his decision, because he was grieving. People often forget that ending the wrong relationship still hurts. Sometimes it hurts deeply. You aren't only losing a person, you're losing the future you imagined. The plans, the dreams, the expectations, the life you thought was waiting for you. I understood that, which was why I didn't rush toward him, didn't say, "I told you so," didn't celebrate being right, because this wasn't a victory. It was a heartbreak, a necessary heartbreak. But heartbreak all the same. After several minutes, Ethan finally walked toward me. His eyes were red, exhausted, broken, and strangely peaceful. The kind of peace that sometimes arrives after an impossible decision has finally been made. "Mom." I looked up. He swallowed hard, then wrapped his arms around me. Not a polite hug, not a brief embrace, a real one. The kind a child gives when they're hurting. The kind that says more than words ever could. I held him tightly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I felt his shoulders begin to shake. And my son cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, honestly, like a man finally allowing himself to feel everything he'd been carrying. "I am so sorry." His voice broke. "I am so sorry." Tears filled my own eyes. I gently rubbed his back. "It's okay." "No." He pulled back slightly. "It's not." The pain in his face was heartbreaking. "I should have protected you." I smiled sadly. "Ethan, I should have listened." He shook his head. "I saw things." Another tear rolled down his cheek. "I kept pretending they weren't important." For a moment, I saw the 6-year-old boy who had lost his father. The little boy who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. The child who once promised to take care of me. That boy was still there. He had simply gotten lost, and now he was finding his way back. I touched his face gently. "You made mistakes." He nodded. "I know. We all do." Silence. Then I added the most important words of all. "I forgive you." His eyes closed, and for the first time all evening, I saw relief. Not happiness. Not yet. Relief. The relief of knowing love had survived. Because that was the thing Vanessa never understood. Real love isn't built on status, or appearances, or money. Real love survives disappointment. It survives mistakes. It survives pain. Several minutes later, Ethan and I walked back toward the ballroom together. The reception had mostly ended. Many guests had already left. Others remained in small groups, quietly discussing the evening. The atmosphere felt completely different from earlier. More subdued, more thoughtful, less performative. Oddly enough, more genuine. As Ethan entered the ballroom, conversations stopped. People looked toward him, not with judgment, with sympathy. Because by then, everyone understood. He hadn't escaped pain. He had chosen it. Chosen it now, rather than later. And sometimes that takes tremendous courage. One by one, relatives approached him, offering support, offering comfort, offering understanding. Melissa hugged him so hard he almost laughed. "About time?" Ethan managed a weak smile. "You too. You drove me crazy for months." For the first time that night, a genuine laugh escaped him. Small, but real. And that mattered. As the evening wound down, Daniel approached me. We stood near one of the ballroom windows overlooking the gardens. The same gardens I'd planted years ago. The same gardens where countless couples had celebrated their futures. Daniel smiled softly. "You okay?" I considered the question, then nodded. "I think so. You handled today better than anyone else could have." I looked outside. The fountain glowed beneath soft lights. The property looked peaceful, almost untouched by the chaos of the day. "I wasn't trying to win." Daniel smiled. "I know." That was the difference. Winning had never been the goal. Protecting my son had been, and somehow, despite everything, that's exactly what had happened. Not through power, Not through wealth, through truth. The following months were not easy. Healing never is. The wedding cancellation became local gossip for a while. People talked, speculated, exaggerated, then eventually moved on. The world always moves on. Meanwhile, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He started therapy, something I was incredibly proud of. He spent time reflecting, learning, growing, and perhaps most importantly, he stopped avoiding difficult conversations. Little by little, I saw him becoming stronger, more confident, more self-aware, more willing to stand up for what mattered. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 6 months after the wedding, he joined me for lunch. Just the two of us, like old times. We sat on my back porch watching birds move between the trees. The same porch where we'd shared countless conversations over the years. For a while, we simply enjoyed the silence. Then Ethan smiled. "You know something." "What?" "I think that wedding saved my life." I looked at him. He laughed softly. "Not the wedding." He corrected himself. "The disaster." I smiled. "That's a strange way to describe it." "I'm serious." He leaned back. "If I'd married the wrong person..." His voice trailed off. Neither of us needed to finish the sentence, because we both knew. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, with gratitude, with love, with understanding. And suddenly, I realized something. The greatest gift I had given my son wasn't money. It wasn't Hunter Estates. It wasn't financial security. It was an example of dignity, of patience, of self-respect, of knowing your worth even when others refuse to see it. 1 year later, Hunter Estates hosted another event, a family celebration. Nothing extravagant, just people who genuinely cared about one another. As I stood beneath the chandeliers that evening, watching laughter fill the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because justice had been served. Not because secrets had been revealed. Not because I owned the venue. None of those things truly mattered. I felt peace because my family had survived. Because Ethan had found his way back to himself. Because love had proven stronger than pride. And because I finally understood something that took me 63 years to learn. People who judge your value by your appearance will eventually reveal their own. But people who know your heart will never need proof of your worth. And in the end, that is the only wealth that truly matters. Life has a way of teaching us difficult lessons through painful experiences. Looking back, I don't believe this story was ever really about money, status, or even a wedding venue. It was about dignity. Too often, people judge others based on appearances. They assume that a simple lifestyle means a simple life. They mistake humility for weakness. They believe that expensive things make people valuable. But character has never lived in a bank account. Kindness cannot be purchased. Integrity doesn't come with a price tag. Another lesson I learned is that silence has consequences. Ethan wasn't a bad man. He loved his family. But every time he ignored disrespect, every time he avoided conflict, he unintentionally allowed harmful behavior to grow. Sometimes love requires courage. Sometimes protecting the people we care about means speaking up even when it's uncomfortable. I also learned that forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiving Ethan didn't erase the pain. It allowed healing to begin. Holding on to bitterness would only have created another wound. Choosing grace gave us a chance to rebuild something stronger. Most importantly, never underestimate a mother's love. A good parent doesn't use power to control their children. They use wisdom to guide them. Sometimes that guidance comes through support. Sometimes it comes through difficult truths. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your appearance, age, job, or lifestyle? What would you have done in Joyce's position? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who might need to hear its message.